Every person in this video had one thing in common. They looked danger straight in the face and then asked it for a high five. These aren't freak accidents. These are carefully self-engineered disasters by people who had every warning, every chance to stop, and chose chaos instead. This is 10 deaths so preventable they almost feel like performance art. Don't try any of this. Seriously, not even close. 1. Let's set the scene in a third-floor apartment complex that smells faintly of boiled cabbage and poor life choices. Meet Dave and Buster, two roommates whose combined IQ couldn't keep a light bulb flickering, let alone solve a complex logistical problem. They were in the process of moving out, a stressful endeavor that usually involves pizza, beer, and losing your security deposit. The centerpiece of their living room was a grand piano. Not a digital keyboard you can tuck under your arm, but a legitimate cast-iron behemoth that weighed roughly as much as a fully loaded vending machine. Now, a rational human being looks at a grand piano on a third floor and thinks, I should hire professionals with cranes and insurance. Dave and Buster looked at it and thought, we have some rope and a combined 20 minutes of Boy Scout experience from 3rd grade. We got this. Their logic was flawed from the very foundation. They didn't want to navigate the narrow, twisting staircase because, frankly, pivot-turning a piano is hard work, and cardio was against their religion. The balcony, however, offered a straight, seductive drop to the moving truck below. It was the siren song of efficiency calling out to the lazy. They rigged up a system of ropes that looked like it was designed by a spider on caffeine. Here is where the physics lesson kicks in, a lesson they were about to learn the hard way. Gravity is a strict mistress, and she doesn't care about your knots. To ensure the piano wouldn't get away from them, they decided to anchor the ropes. Did they anchor them to a structural pillar? No. Did they use a winch? Of course not. They tied the ropes around their own waists. Yes, you heard that right. They tethered themselves to an 800-pound anvil like they were taking a very heavy, very dead dog for a walk. Their plan was to function as human counterweights, assuming that their beer bellies provided enough mass to slowly lower a concert instrument. As they pushed the piano over the railing, the laws of motion suspended their disbelief for a split second before kicking in with ruthless aggression. The piano didn't gently float down, it plummeted. The sudden, violent jerk of the rope didn't just pull on them, it launched them. They cleared the railing with the grace of two ragdolls fired from a cannon, trailing behind the musical instrument like the tail of a very stupid comet. There wasn't even time to scream, just a sudden realization that they were now part of the payload. The impact on the pavement below was less of a thud and more of a discordant, chaotic symphony of wood, wire, and regret. The police report noted that while the piano was tuned to A440 before the fall, it was tuned to flat pancake afterwards, much like the two geniuses who thought they could outmuscle gravity. They didn't just die, they became a cautionary cartoon, a 3-part harmony of destruction that left the neighborhood wondering why it was raining men and music. 2. Let's talk about Gary, a suburban dad who treated instruction manuals with the same disdain he held for vegans and speed limits. It was the middle of the great blizzard of the decade, the kind of storm that knocks out power grids and turns modern homes into glorified igloos. But Gary was prepared. He had purchased a top-of-the-line, industrial-grade portable gas generator, a roaring beast of an engine capable of powering a small village or, more importantly, his man cave refrigerator. Now, the generator came with a manual the size of a novel, filled with bold, red warnings that essentially screamed, "Do not use indoors or you will die." Gary, however, considered himself a man of practical intelligence, which is usually code for, I'm going to do something incredibly dangerous because I'm cold. He didn't want to leave his precious new machine outside in the sleet where it might get wet or, God forbid, stolen by a freezing neighbor. His solution? The attached garage. In Gary's mind, the garage was technically outside because that's where the car lives, and cars have exhaust too, right? He placed the generator inside, cranked it up until it was roaring like a jet engine, and then, here's the stroke of genius, he ran the extension cord through the door connecting the garage to the kitchen. To accommodate the cord, he had to leave the door cracked open about 2 inches. He looked at that 2-inch gap, then he looked at the massive 2-car garage, and decided that the ventilation ratio was in his favor. He assumed the exhaust fumes, being polite guests, would stay in the garage while the electricity flowed into the house. What Gary failed to grasp is that carbon monoxide is not a polite guest. It is a heavy, relentless, invisible assassin that fills a space exactly like water filling a tank. As the generator chugged away, pumping out death at 5,000 watts, the gas accumulated in the garage and then poured through that 2-inch gap under the kitchen door like a fog of war. It seeped into the living room where Gary was sitting on his couch, wrapped in a blanket, feeling smugly superior to his neighbors who were currently shivering in the dark. The gas is odorless and tasteless, so Gary didn't choke or cough. He just started to feel a little tired. Just a quick nap, he thought, attributing his drowsiness to the cozy warmth he had so cleverly engineered. He drifted off to sleep, his lungs slowly swapping oxygen for poison, and he never woke up. The next morning, the generator was still running, fueling the TV for an audience of a corpse. Gary had managed to keep the lights on, but unfortunately, he had permanently turned his own switch to off, proving that while you can cheat the power company, you can never cheat chemistry. 3. We travel now to the sun-baked, danger-filled continent of Australia, a land where every shrub, spider, and seashell is actively plotting your demise. But for our hero, a gym-obsessed adrenaline junkie named Kevin, the local wildlife wasn't a threat. It was a challenge to his masculinity. Kevin was the kind of guy who wore sunglasses indoors and referred to himself in the third person. He was visiting a wildlife sanctuary with a group of friends, and they came upon the enclosure of the southern cassowary. For those of you who skipped biology class to smoke behind the bleachers, a cassowary is essentially a 6-foot-tall turkey that went to prison and learned how to use a shiv. It has a bone helmet, eyes that have seen the void, and a 5-inch dagger-like claw on its inner toe specifically evolved to disembowel predators. The enclosure had signs, lots of them. Danger, do not enter, and pictures of stick figures getting absolutely wrecked. Kevin looked at the bird, then at his biceps, and decided the bird looked soft. He wanted a viral video for his social media, something that screamed apex predator. He turned to his friends, handed one his phone, and said the famous last words of the terminally stupid, "Watch this, I'm gonna wrestle it." He hopped the fence with the confidence of a man who has never been punched in the face. The cassowary didn't retreat. It didn't flap its wings in fear. It stood there, tilting its head, likely wondering why lunch was delivering itself. Kevin approached, arms wide in a grappling stance, making "here kitty kitty" noises at a descendant of the velociraptor. The engagement lasted approximately 0.4 seconds. Kevin lunged. The cassowary, which can jump 7 feet straight up and kick with enough force to shatter concrete, unleashed a flying karate kick that would have made Bruce Lee retire in shame. That dagger claw connected with Kevin's torso with surgical precision. It wasn't a fight. It was an industrial accident. The bird didn't just kick him, it unzipped him like a cheap duffel bag. Kevin hit the ground with a look of pure, unadulterated shock, realizing too late that bench pressing 200 pounds means absolutely nothing against a dinosaur with knives for feet. The video did indeed go viral, but not in the way Kevin intended. Instead of "Kevin dominates nature," the title was closer to "Local idiot loses argument with flightless bird." He died in the dirt, a victim of his own ego, while the cassowary went back to pecking at seeds, completely unimpressed by the so-called alpha male. 4. Let's take a trip to the wind-swept, sandy beaches of the East Coast, a place where history lies buried beneath the dunes, waiting for someone with a metal detector and a complete lack of self-preservation to dig it up. Enter Arthur, a self-proclaimed amateur archaeologist, whose credentials consisted entirely of watching 3 seasons of history documentaries and owning a shovel he bought at a hardware store discount bin. Arthur was the kind of guy who believed that warning signs were just the government's way of hoarding all the cool stuff for themselves. On this particular Tuesday, his cheap metal detector started screaming like a banshee over a patch of wet sand. After 20 minutes of sweating and digging, Arthur pulled out a heavy, rusted, spherical object. It was a cannonball, a relic from the 19th century, likely fired during a naval skirmish and buried by time and tide. Now, a normal person, someone who enjoys having all their limbs attached to their torso, would look at an unexploded piece of military ordnance and call the bomb squad, or the police, or literally anyone with a badge and a blast shield. But not Arthur. Arthur looked at this rusty sphere of death and thought, I bet this would look great on my mantle next to the bowling trophy. He lugged the heavy iron ball to his car, drove it home, hitting every pothole along the way, mind you, treating a live explosive like a sack of potatoes, and carried it down to his basement workshop. Here is where the dumb dial gets turned up to 11. Arthur was consumed by curiosity. He wanted to know if the cannonball was solid iron or if it was a hollow shell filled with powder. There are safe ways to determine this, involving X-rays or experts, but Arthur was a man of action. He decided to drill a little peekaboo hole into the side of the artifact. He clamped the cannonball into a vise, grabbed his high-torque power drill, and selected a nice, sharp titanium bit. Now, let's have a quick chemistry refresher for those in the back. Black powder, the stuff used in these old munitions, is remarkably stable. Until it isn't. It doesn't expire like milk. It doesn't turn into harmless dust. It stays potent, and over 150 years, it can become unstable, crystallizing into a substance that really, really hates friction. Friction, coincidentally, is exactly what a high-speed drill bit creates. As Arthur bore down on the drill, humming a little tune, the metal tip heated up, glowing red-hot as it chewed through the iron casing. Inside the shell, the ancient gunpowder woke up from its century-long nap and realized there was an intruder. The spark generated by the drill bit meeting the inner chamber didn't just say hello, it screamed. The resulting explosion was instantaneous and catastrophic. It wasn't a poof. It was a thunderclap that shook the entire neighborhood. The cannonball didn't just break. It fragmented into high-velocity shrapnel that turned Arthur's basement into a confetti cannon of wood, metal, and bad decisions. Arthur was standing approximately 6 inches from ground zero. He didn't even have time to be surprised. The blast confirmed his theory. Yes, it was hollow, and yes, it was full of gunpowder. He became the last official casualty of the Civil War, nearly 2 centuries after the peace treaty was signed, proving that while history is written by the victors, the Darwin Awards are written by the guys who take power tools to bombs. 5. There is a fine line between bravery and insanity, and then there is a massive gaping chasm of stupidity, and at the bottom of that chasm, we find a farmer named Billy Bob. Billy Bob lived a quiet life on the edge of a dense forest, but quiet wasn't what he wanted. He wanted internet fame. He had seen videos of bull riding. He had seen videos of horse breaking, but he felt the world was ready for something new, something grittier. He wanted to pioneer the sport of boar riding. Now, for those of you who have never encountered a feral hog, let me paint you a picture. Imagine a Honda Civic made of muscle, wrapped in coarse hair, and fueled entirely by rage and testosterone. These are not cute piglets. They are 300-pound tanks with tusks that can rip through a car door. Billy Bob managed to trap one of these nightmares in a cage, which should have been the peak of his achievement. Instead, it was just the prelude to his demise. He decided he was going to saddle this beast and ride it for a viral video that would make him the king of the county. But Billy Bob had a concern. He knew that boars are erratic and slippery. He didn't want to get bucked off in the first 3 seconds and look like an amateur. So he came up with a solution that was as permanent as it was idiotic. He didn't just saddle the boar, he tied himself to it. He used industrial-strength ratchet straps to secure his legs to the animal's flanks and roped his hands to the makeshift harness. He essentially became a biological backpack on a creature that wanted to kill him. He yelled to his friend, who was holding the camera and trembling, "Open the gate." The gate opened. Now a horse might buck. A bull might spin. A feral boar? It panics and bolts. It doesn't run in circles, it runs for cover. The boar launched out of the cage like a hairy missile, accelerating from 0 to 30 miles per hour in seconds. Billy Bob realized his mistake immediately, but thanks to his genius knot-tying skills, he couldn't dismount. He was literally strapped to the roller coaster. The boar didn't head for the open field. It headed straight for the dense, briar-filled forest. The ride lasted approximately 4 minutes, but for Billy Bob, it must have felt like an eternity. The The boar smashed through underbrush, scraped against jagged rocks, and pinballed off oak trees, using Billy Bob as a human bumper. Every time the boar zagged, Billy Bob zigged directly into a tree trunk. The safety straps held firm, dragging him through a gauntlet of nature's cruelty. By the time the boar finally exhausted itself and stopped miles deep in the woods, Billy Bob was no longer a rider. He was a cautionary tale about the importance of quick-release mechanisms. He didn't fall off just like he planned. But the victory was short-lived, as the high-speed impact trauma turned his internal organs into a smoothie. He wanted to be a cowboy, but he ended up being a drag toy, proving that if you love something, set it free. But for the love of God, don't tie yourself to it first. 6. Let's descend into the dim, yeast-scented world of amateur home brewing, a hobby usually reserved for patient men with beards and sandals. But not for Keith. Keith was a man who lived life in the fast lane, a man who microwaved his Pop-Tarts because waiting 3 minutes for the toaster felt like a lifetime. Keith had decided to make sparkling wine, a delicate process that requires precise chemistry, controlled temperatures, and weeks of slow fermentation to build up carbonation naturally. But Keith looked at the calendar and decided that weeks was a unit of time for suckers. He wanted his booze, and he wanted it now. He had a theory based on absolutely zero scientific evidence that he could supercharge the fermentation process by adding heat. He reasoned that heat makes molecules move faster, so heat must make alcohol faster, right? He took 3 dozen heavy glass carboys, those big, thick jugs, filled them with his unstable grape juice mixture, sealed them tight with corks and wire cages so the gas couldn't escape, and placed them in a small, unventilated closet. Then, he installed 2 industrial-grade heat lamps, the kind used to keep French fries warm or incubate lizard eggs, and pointed them directly at the glass. He shut the door and waited. Inside that closet, a physics experiment from hell was taking place. The heat ramped up the yeast activity, producing massive amounts of CO2. Simultaneously, the heat expanded the gas that was already there. The pressure inside the glass bottles began to climb, and climb, and climb. They turned into pressurized glass grenades, ticking away in the dark. A few hours later, Keith decided to do a quality control check. He wanted to see if the wine was fizzing. He walked up to the closet, turned the handle, and opened the door. The sudden change in air pressure, or perhaps just the vibration of his footsteps, was the final straw. As he leaned in, face first, to inspect his creation, the structural integrity of the frontmost carboy failed. The bottle didn't just crack, it detonated. The pressure release was so violent it shattered the thick glass into thousands of razor-sharp shards, blasting outward at the speed of sound. It was like a claymore mine made of Chardonnay. A large, jagged shard of the carboy flew directly into Keith's neck, severing his jugular vein instantly. He collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by the smell of cheap grapes and bad decisions, as the other bottles started to sympathetic detonate in a chain reaction of stupidity. Keith died in a pool of his own impatient creation, proving that you can't rush art, and you certainly can't rush fermentation unless you want your last drink to be a lethal injection of glass. He wanted a sparkling wine that really popped, and congratulations, Keith, you absolutely nailed it. 7. 50 euros. That's about 54 American dollars. The price of a mediocre steak dinner, a tank of gas on a good day, or roughly 1/10,000th of what a funeral costs. It is not, by any functioning definition of logic, an amount worth dying for. But when has logic ever stopped anyone in these stories? Our setting is a perfectly respectable mid-sized bank in Western Europe, where a custodian we'll call Henrik had spent 9 quiet, uneventful years mopping floors, emptying bins, and existing in the kind of peaceful professional invisibility that most people would envy. Henrik was reliable, punctual, and completely unremarkable, except for one quirk that his coworkers found endlessly entertaining. The man could not walk past money on the ground. Dropped coins, crumpled bills, loose change behind the vending machine. Henrik vacuumed it all up like a Roomba programmed exclusively for currency. His colleagues called him the human metal detector, and he wore it like a badge of honor. Now the bank's main vault operated on an automated time lock. a 20-ton steel door that began its closing sequence every evening at the exact same minute. And because the engineers understood that humans are fundamentally incapable of self-preservation, they'd equipped the process with a warning system so aggressive it bordered on insulting. Flashing red strobes, a klaxon loud enough to rattle dental fillings, a countdown timer, and voice alerts in 3 languages all screaming the same thing. Stay out, the vault is closing, we mean it. Henrik had watched this door close roughly 2,000 times. He knew the timing, the sounds, the rhythm, and that familiarity is precisely what killed him, because watching something 2,000 times doesn't make you an expert. It makes you dangerously comfortable. See, Henrik always observed from a distance. From across the floor, the door's closing sequence looked uniform. One smooth, steady swing from open to shut. What he'd never noticed, because he'd never been stupid enough to stand close during the final seconds, was that the door had 2 phases. The first was slow, almost gentle, a courtesy window for anyone still nearby. The second, when the hydraulics engaged full compression to create an airtight seal, was fast and carried the kind of force that doesn't distinguish between a steel barricade and a human ribcage. The door had no obstruction sensor, no safety cutoff. It was engineered to seal completely once initiated, because the entire point of a bank vault is that it does not negotiate. Not with robbers, not with hostage situations, and certainly not with custodians chasing pocket change. So when Henrik spotted a 50-euro note on the vault floor just as the sirens began their nightly symphony, his brain made a calculation that would embarrass a golden retriever. He'd seen the slow phase 1,000 times. He could beat it. Easy. Indiana Jones stuff. He lunged past the strobes, under the screaming sirens, and snagged the bill with genuinely impressive hand-eye coordination. His exit strategy, however, had the structural integrity of a wet napkin. The door's second phase engaged while Henrik was still in the frame, and 20 tons of hydraulic steel did what 20 tons of hydraulic steel does. It closed, completely and without a shred of mercy. When the time lock released the next morning, security found Henrik still pinned in the doorframe, the 50-euro note clenched in his fist like the world's most pathetic trophy. The bank reviewed its procedures and changed absolutely nothing, because every warning system had worked flawlessly. The sirens screamed. The lights flashed. 3 languages told him to stay out. Henrik heard all of it and chose 50 euros instead. 8. The saltwater crocodile has been killing things for 200 million years, which means it was already an apex predator back when dinosaurs were still working out their long-term career plans. A full-grown salty can exceed 20 feet, weigh more than a compact car, and bite down with 3,700 pounds of force per square inch, enough to crush a bowling ball and still look like it's barely trying. They are the most efficient ambush killers the planet has ever produced, and they do their best work in exactly the kind of murky, slow-moving river water where you can't see them until it's already a story someone tells at your memorial. All of which was common knowledge in Australia's Northern Territory, where a 26-year-old local we'll call Darren had spent his entire life marinating in crocodile awareness. This was not a confused tourist from Melbourne who thought a salty was just a big gecko with a PR problem. Darren was a territory kid, raised on croc safety lectures, warning signs at every river crossing, and the general understanding that the water belongs to the crocodiles, and they enforce that lease with the enthusiasm of a landlord who is also a prehistoric killing machine. He knew. He'd always known. And then one evening, a case of beer and his brother Craig conspired to delete approximately 26 years of survival knowledge in under 30 seconds. The dare was simple, elegant, and catastrophically stupid. Who could swim across the river faster? Not jog to the gas station, not arm wrestle. A swimming race across a body of water where the locals wouldn't even let their dogs drink from the bank because the dogs had more sense than Darren was currently exhibiting. Darren went first, wading into the river on a humid evening with the surface flat and glassy in the way that only water concealing something terrible can manage. He made it maybe 20 feet, about the length of a living room, before the river stopped pretending to be peaceful. Crocodile attacks don't build dramatic tension. There's no fin, no ripple, no soundtrack. There's calm, and then there's a 16-foot, 1,000-pound reptile detonating upward from below at a speed that fundamentally rewrites your understanding of how fast something that size can move through water. The answer is faster than you. Not slightly faster. Faster in the way that a missile is faster than a paper airplane. The attack lasted seconds. Darren never reached the halfway point, never had a chance to turn back, never even had time for the full scope of his mistake to register in the part of his brain still capable of processing anything besides blind terror. Craig, standing on the bank watching the water erupt into a scene no nature documentary would air without a warning, did not enter the river. The competitive fire that had been burning in his chest 4 seconds earlier was now permanently and completely extinguished. Search teams located remains in the river days later. The coroner's report was as straightforward as paperwork gets when the cause of death is voluntarily entered the hunting ground of an animal that has been perfecting this exact kill for longer than mammals have existed. Wildlife authorities issued a statement that read less like an official communication and more like a tired parent explaining, for the absolute last time, why we do not touch the stove. 200 million years of evolution versus one beer-soaked dare. The crocodile didn't even need to improvise. 9. Fandom is a spectrum, and most people live comfortably near the harmless end. A poster on the wall, a phone background, maybe one tattoo they'll explain at parties. Then there's Takeshi, a 31-year-old office worker from Saitama Prefecture, Japan, who blew past the harmless end at full speed, crashed through the guardrail of sanity, and kept accelerating. Takeshi's obsession with a character from a massively popular action RPG had long ago stopped being a hobby and started being a one-man identity replacement program. Step 1. He legally changed his name through the Japanese court system. Actual paperwork, actual judge, actual government-issued ID now matching a fictional swordsman made of polygons. Step 2. Over $40,000 in plastic surgery across multiple procedures. Cheekbone implants, chin reshaping, custom contact lenses, skin treatments. All calibrated to transform his face into a living replica of a character who exists exclusively inside a graphics engine. And the disturbing part? It worked. Photos went semi-viral. A niche internet following emerged, split between genuine admiration and deep existential concern. Takeshi, high on validation, decided the transformation had one final milestone: the hair. The character's signature look was a gravity-defying explosion of rigid silver spikes, the kind of hairstyle that only functions in a world where physics has a pause button and hair isn't subject to mass, wind, or the basic concept of down. Every professional stylist he consulted gave the same verdict: impossible. The strongest salon products could hold a modest spike for hours, not days. What Takeshi wanted required hair to defy its own weight permanently, and human keratin is simply not that ambitious. A normal person stops here. Takeshi, who had renamed himself after a fictional character and surgically remodeled his own skull, was not in the vicinity of normal. His solution, born from a brainstorming session that should have been a therapy appointment, was a homemade sculpting compound, quick-setting cement mixed with industrial bonding adhesive, creating a paste he could mold into permanent rock-hard spikes. He applied it meticulously, sculpting each spike with the obsessive focus of an artist who has completely lost the ability to distinguish between genius and self-destruction. It hardened beautifully. The spikes were magnificent, rigid, towering, perfect. And this is where basic chemistry, a subject Takeshi had apparently skipped in favor of cosplay tutorials, entered the conversation with extremely bad news. Cement is caustic. This is not obscure medical trivia. It's on the safety data sheet that Takeshi definitely did not read. Wet cement has a pH between 12 and 13, making it strongly alkaline. And when packed directly against skin in an airtight layer, it begins inflicting deep chemical burns almost immediately. The calcium hydroxide penetrates tissue progressively, destroying cells layer by layer without the dramatic pain signals of a thermal burn, meaning the damage advances silently while the victim assumes the mild irritation is just discomfort from the weight. By the time Takeshi registered that something was genuinely wrong, escalating headache, nausea, dizziness, the cement had been eating through his scalp for hours, and the alkaline compounds had entered his bloodstream through the destroyed tissue. His body responded with massive inflammatory swelling. His brain, trapped inside a skull now dealing with systemic chemical toxicity and rapidly increasing intracranial pressure, began to shut down. A neighbor heard him collapse. Paramedics found him unconscious, the cement shell fused to what remained of his scalp, and the situation already beyond intervention. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. Fatal cerebral edema secondary to severe chemical burns and systemic alkaline poisoning. Every spike was still standing. The transformation was finally complete, right down to the character's dramatic, untimely death scene. 10. Tempered safety glass is genuinely remarkable. Engineered to flex under impact, distribute force across the pane, and resist shattering under conditions that would turn regular glass into a 1,000-piece puzzle. It handles high winds, thermal stress, and debris impacts with quiet, reliable competence. What it was never designed to handle, and what no engineer in history has ever stress-tested for, is a 180-pound attorney hurling himself into it shoulder first on a bi-weekly basis for entertainment purposes. But that was the signature move of a Toronto senior partner we'll call Gerald, who occupied a corner office on the 24th floor of a downtown financial tower and had decided that the most compelling way to showcase his building's engineering was to use his own body as a crash test dummy. Gerald's party trick, and I use trick, the way a coroner might use contributing factor, was taking a running start and body-checking his floor-to-ceiling window to prove the glass was unbreakable. He did it for clients, for new associates, for visiting guests, and for anyone else who hadn't yet learned to decline a tour of Gerald's office. And it worked. Every single time the glass flexed, absorbed the hit, and Gerald bounced off grinning, probably nursing a bruised shoulder he'd never admit to. He'd done it dozens of times over several years, and each successful demonstration cemented his conviction that the stunt was perfectly safe. This is textbook survivorship bias, literally. Every time the chamber came up empty, Gerald became more certain the gun wasn't loaded, which is exactly the logic that keeps casinos profitable and emergency rooms busy. Because while Gerald was busy testing the glass, he was simultaneously and unknowingly destroying everything holding the glass in place. The aluminum brackets, the rubber gaskets, the anchor bolts connecting the frame to the building's curtain wall. None of it was engineered to absorb repeated lateral impacts from a full-grown man. Each collision filed a tiny invisible damage report. Micro-fractures in the bolts, compression fatigue in the gaskets, incremental loosening that no one ever inspected because no one had ever imagined a scenario requiring it. The final demonstration came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon for a group of visiting law students. Bright, eager kids who'd come to learn about corporate litigation and were about to receive an education in physics no textbook could provide. Gerald ran through his usual build-up, the specs, the certifications, the showmanship, then launched himself shoulder first into the glass. And the glass, loyal to the absolute end, did not break. Not a crack, not a chip, not a scratch. What failed was the frame. The weakest bolts gave first, and once they did, the remaining fasteners couldn't handle the redistributed load. The frame failed in a chain reaction that lasted less than a second. The entire pane popped cleanly out of the wall, sailing into open air with Gerald still pressed against it, riding it down 24 stories like the world's worst magic carpet. The glass shattered only on impact with the courtyard below, well after its passenger had already reached a destination from which no appeal, motion, or continuance could save him. Gerald was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death? The fall. Not the glass. The glass was perfect. His firm quietly killed the office tour program, and the building issued new guidelines that presumably included the phrase, "Do not body check the windows," somewhere near the top. Gerald spent years proving the glass couldn't break and died confirming it. Spectacularly right about the product, fatally wrong about everything holding it in place. That's 10 people who bet against Darwin and lost. Now, which death was the most preventable? All 10 had warnings. All 10 ignored them. But one of these people had absolutely zero excuse. Drop your number in the comments, like if your brain works better than theirs, and subscribe before the next batch arrives.